I want to start off with the fact that you've been in the industry and with the IFC for quite a number of years, and you have then, I'm sure, witnessed some of the transformation that has been happening in Africa, specifically around the energy sector. So what I'd like to hear about is what stood out for you and why that stood out for you.
Yeah, sure. Look, I think if you go back to when I started in the 80s, I mean, the landscape would be totally unrecognizable today, largely because the energy sectors were essentially government-owned everywhere. So you had no IPPs, no sector reform. That really didn't get started until the 90s. We had a couple of decades where things moved pretty slowly. 90s and 2000s, you had a few countries that sort of began to reform sectors, Cameroon, Ivory Coast, Kenya, and the first few IPPs showing up. But when I say the first few, I really mean the first few. So for the first decade, the 1990s, you basically, for all of sub-Saharan Africa, all 40-plus countries, you had one IPP every 2 years through the 90s, reaching financial close. And then in the 2000s, it got up to about 2 every year, but still really tiny up until about 2010. And then the last few years is when you've really seen, the beginnings of a jump, where you now have IPPs in a greater number of countries. You have sector reforms at least starting, if not complete, in a much larger number of countries in the region. And with now the arrival of both renewables and gas, you have really you're kind of on a cusp of a boom here for private participation in energy that would have been totally unpredictable even 5 years ago.
In terms of what has been happening over the past few decades in Africa, is keeping pace with global transition?
Well, I think by and large, through the up until about 2010, certainly, you could very safely say that Africa was well behind the rest of the world in terms of sector reforms and the levels of efficiency in the sectors and participation of private capital. But here again, the South African auctions have really revolutionized the scene, and now with the 4 rounds of the auctions that have gone through here and the beginnings of the auctions spreading to other markets in the continent, now all of a sudden Africa is at least on a par, if not ahead, of the rest of the world in this particular dimension. So it's actually the jump has been quite impressive.
Yeah. So this brings me then to scaling solar. It's an initiative, if I understand correctly, within the IFC. So if you can talk a little bit around what is the purpose of this initiative and what has happened since its inception.
Sure, Nicole. So this is one we're super excited about. I call it more properly World Bank Group rather than just IFC initiative. But a lot of this has been about looking at how REIPPP has been great for South Africa and understanding what brought about this success and how it could be replicated. I mean, no one 5 years ago would have thought that renewables could have provided the whatever 10 to 15% of system capacity here in the country at the prices that the latest auctions have achieved. So, we looked at what worked there and saw that what was happening in South Africa was also happening in a number of other emerging markets like Brazil, Chile, India, several others. And it was clear to us that this was really some kind of procurement revolution with huge impact on costs. We could see, just like we saw in South Africa, that countries that put in place these kind of systems saw prices dropping between 30 and 50% over a 2-year period. So and therefore the countries that didn't have the wherewithal to figure out how to do what the South Africans did would be stuck with much higher cost energy options, which take a long time to implement, and therefore, in fact, fall farther behind the countries that were able to do this. So we really wanted to bring these kind of options to the rest of Africa, and that's what scaling solar is about. Is really just copying a lot of what's been done here in terms of the auction mechanism and standardization of bidding processes and contracts. So 4 countries have signed on in the 18 months since we've started this. Zambia, Senegal, Ethiopia, and Madagascar. The first to sign on was Zambia, which since then has experienced an oversubscribed expression of interest and winning bids at cost way below what was initially anticipated for Zambia. So 6 to 7 cents a kilowatt hour. It's a bit higher than the most recent auctions here in South Africa, but lower than the initial ones. And the 2 winning projects in the first round of procurement are on the brink of reaching financial close, and the Zambians have just announced that they're going to start a second round of bidding. And interestingly, on your first question of is Africa behind, here now we have a number of countries outside of Africa asking for this same kind of support, and then so here we have Africa actually leading the way. The message is, look, the storage is still expensive, but it's expensive in the same way that solar energy was expensive 5-6 years ago. So the cost curves, if you look at the cost curves for storage capacity, they look identical to the cost curves of wind or solar, again, 5-6 years ago. So we would expect in turn, 5-6 years from now, that the cost of storage are going to be about half of what they are now. Now that means that solar plus storage by 2021, 2022, likely is going to be competitive with the cost of new build coal plants.
Okay.
And that's a pretty big deal.
Yes.
Again, storage comes in a lot of different, so it's not one homogeneous thing, but for the kind of 2 to 4 hour storage packages, battery models that allow you to spread into the peak demand periods, it's going to be a real thing within 4 or 5 years. So the key issue in Africa is going to be, and for opportunities for African investors, the key issue is really going to be governments creating a regulatory environment that's conducive to bringing in storage and getting the right advice to do that. That's a lesson you can already see in a place like the U.S. where different states have different regulatory environments, and the penetration of storage, the deployment of storage varies dramatically depending on how on what that regulatory environment is. So I think this is something where we expect as the World Bank Group to be particularly focused on in the coming years, and that'll be the big driver of how quickly this becomes opportunities for African operators and investors.
Yeah. So my next question actually leads a bit into that, because I'd like to know what advice you could give to an African entrepreneur or an African company in the energy and power industry in terms of getting involved in tenders and access to funding and putting forward bankable projects.
Well, I think at one level, really the advice here is no different than the advice for businesses anywhere. The 2 key issues that really drive bankability and the ability to get things done are around execution capability and financial structure. I think we've seen this in wind and in solar with some of the companies that have run into difficulties, and overwhelmingly the biggest cause has been too much leverage and companies getting into too many things that they were able to execute. So that's business advice that is similar pretty much everywhere. In terms of tenders, I think I would hope that tenders are going to continue to multiply. in the continent, hopefully across more countries. And I would also be expecting costs to continue coming down, both because the cost of the underlying technology continue to come down, but also because competitors figure out, are always getting smarter about how they can squeeze out another cent here or a cent there in the overall cost structure. So I think there are going to be I think the opportunities are really going to grow. But they're also, I would think, going to be increasingly competitive at the same time. So maybe the best piece of advice is really around the amount of opportunities. So lobbying that governments do move forward and change their enabling and regulatory environments to take advantage of these lower cost opportunities in energy is going to be the big driver of how much there is to choose from.
Right, there's a lot of opportunities out there, and possibly it's a case of many African entrepreneurs are not aware of those opportunities. So where do they go to find them?
Well, so at this point, we're still talking future opportunities rather than present opportunities, I think. So there's a bit of a chicken and egg question about whether the right tactic is just wait for governments to announce that they are going to move on new programs, as was the case in South Africa, or is beginning to be the case in the countries where we're going with scaling solar, or some of the other countries that are moving on other programs. And the other tactic is to join up with allies and be active participants in encouraging and advocating that governments set up these opportunities, which really should be of great benefit to the economies, because almost all of these opportunities involve countries getting lower cost energy than they have been getting. But right now the big bottleneck is around reforms and more potential opportunities coming to market.
Right. And then this brings me to the question around local content, which is something that many African countries are implementing, specifically in South Africa, where any project has to have a certain percentage in terms of local content. So my question then is this hampering manufacturing, and is this maybe something that we need to step away from?
Well, it's a good question, and I think an area of that has been and will continue to be of lively debate. The motivations for governments, particularly in larger economies, to go with local content regulations are completely understandable. I mean, that one wants to take advantage as much as possible of job creation opportunities. Job creation is a huge political issue in lots of countries, including of course South Africa. I think so far the general experience that we have seen in the large emerging markets with local content for renewables has not been great. So far, the recent reports we've seen, Brazil would be an example of a country that started on this track a couple of years ahead of South Africa. And right now, the reports tend to show cost differences for domestically supplied turbines, for example, in the 40% range. Yeah. So what that means is that the trade-off between getting the domestic jobs through the turbine manufacturing and the price of the cost of the energy that's been produced is much higher than people had anticipated when the regulations came in. And so what Brazil is actually experiencing, which is interesting, is a large number of projects where there's been a winning bid, but the projects can't be completed because of issues in terms of either cost overruns or simply supply chain issues. So somebody bids and wins the right to produce a certain amount of, 100 megawatts of electricity based on having some particular supplier in the country. And if that supplier runs into a problem, then they're really stuck. Because it's not like if you're sourcing internationally and, one of your Chinese manufacturers doesn't deliver on time, so you go to an Indian one or you go to a European one or whatever, you have all sorts of options. But the problem with the local content manufacturer, again, I stress the experience so far, has been that narrowing of choices is translating into higher costs and a number of projects not actually getting completed. So, I think the verdict is still out, but it's but the early returns are not really encouraging.
So would you say that these policies need to be a little bit more flexible?
Well, I think that's one of the lessons that's being drawn of the early experience in again a place like Brazil. I think people are waiting to see a little bit what's the experience here in South Africa, India as well. So places that are implementing these and trying to understand, do the trade-offs make sense in the long run? Can they be fixed by flexibility? I don't think anybody has the right answer yet.
So the next question that I have is for you on a personal level, in terms of power sector projects that you have come across in any country that have particularly impressed you, and why that particular project?
That made me the most difficult question because I tend to be impressed by a lot of what I see. So selection is a little bit difficult. But thanks for having given me the heads up on those. Let me suggest three that I see that I found impressive for slightly different reasons, all here in Africa. The first one are the two IPPs in the Ivory Coast, Azito and Ciprel, because they were some of the first IPPs here in Africa, and they were in a country that went through protracted civil strife not that long ago. And all through the conflict, both power plants, not only did the power plants continue to operate, but their contractual structure held up through the entire time. So that was really impressive to see that if you get a project done right, even in the middle of a major civil conflict, they can survive, continue to provide services, and then be ready, as was the case for both of them at the cessation of the conflict to expand services and to draw in new investment. So I think those have been particularly impressive.
That is quite, yes.
Yeah, no, frankly, then the next one is here. I think that the entire REIPPP program has been, one of the most impressive programs that I've seen, anywhere in the world. I mean, I understand there's a lot of political debate now internally.
That's right.
But certainly what has been achieved is one of the most impressive things that I've seen in the energy sectors, especially in renewable. Really, it's been a top-notch program in terms of design and execution. And one last one I'll add in. There's a very recent one in a completely different place, which is the Sierra Leone Western Area Power Generation Project. The first ever IPP in Sierra Leone, right as the country is beginning to get a bit more stable after a long period of conflict. And really, I thought tremendously impressive that all the people involved could work to put something together which would attract risk capital and really a private IPP into a situation like that. So I think that's a great sign, and certainly a model that we're looking to replicate in other complex places that are coming out of conflict.
That's right. And you find that once these projects are up and running, they actually do have a tremendous impact on the country's economy.
Oh, dramatic! Yes, absolutely.
Yeah.
So one of the most important things you can do is get the lights on and staying on.
My last question to you is around your predictions for the African market, and what are your personal hopes and dreams that can be realized through a lot of the initiatives that are out there?
Lower cost of energy throughout the continent. really just taking advantage of this these revolutions in renewables and gas. I think really there's just such a dramatic opportunity to have make a huge impact in the cost of doing business and the cost of providing services all throughout the continent. So that's really the big one. I think to get there, the second one, which is really about getting there, is I hope that these enabling sector reforms that you've been seeing in a handful of countries multiply across more countries in the region. A big priority for the World Bank Group. And I think there's a real opportunity, especially since now there's such a big carrot in terms of the potential lower energy costs. And I think within that, I think the next big wave will be around the transmission and distribution systems.
Okay.
We need to transition into next generation models to take advantage of these things. And then last, I also hope that storage, which we talked about, the storage and distributed generation solutions do enable a lot of progress in reaching those that without access. So three very small hopes. Still a heck of a lot of work to get to any of them, but I think one could be, in spite of the sort of somewhat depressed economic environment in a lot of the continent, I think one could be more hopeful about this than one has been ever before.
Right. I think that one of the biggest concerns on a local level are for municipalities, and the energy sector, electricity sector is transitioning at a rapid rate, and I don't think they're really ready to keep up with that. I think they are struggling financially in terms of a lot of people then getting distributed energy from somewhere else.
Yep. And that's precisely the kind of thing I'm talking about, that you can see the rest of the world, well, you can see a number of countries beginning to react to this technology change by putting in place the reforms that allows sub-areas to take advantage of this. So cities, for example, you can see this in China. It's a big part of what's going on now. But to get there, that requires a bunch of reforms to the way the utilities work today in the whole region, and the kind of monopoly type service provision is difficult to it's difficult to have that and to deliver on an independent basis the kind of things that the cities need, because very much in the next wave of sector reforms that we have to look to make this possible.
Right. Well, Benny, thank you so much for your time, and I hope that you enjoy the rest of your stay in Johannesburg, and that maybe one day I will see you in Cape Town.
Well, Cape Town's a lovely place.
This is where the reform is happening.
Well, actually, Cape Town is a city that we're working with.